The Flor de la Mar was a 400-ton carrack and the pride of the 4th Portuguese Armada. She was the biggest ship that Portugal had ever built thus far. On her maiden voyage, she had made it all the way to India, captained by Vasco de Gama. She was now under the command of Estevão's relative, the Admiral Vasco de Gama. Vasco de Gama had come back to India to assert his king's dominance over trade in the Indian Ocean. In doing so, he had left a path of carnage and destruction in his wake. But now, his luck had run dry. The Zamorin, the Samudri Raja of Calicut, had caught him in a trap. The Raja had managed to lure the admiral into the harbor of the great trading city under the premise of negotiating a treaty, but this time around, there was going to be absolutely no discussions. Early the next morning, Vasco found himself surrounded, outnumbered, and under attack by a large fleet of ships. Even a nearby vessel had been set ablaze, and the now fire barge was released in Gama's direction. To make matters even worse, the night before, the admiral had ordered his men to secure the ship in place using a heavy metal chain, which now, of course, prevented him from escaping. Gama had most of his men take cover below deck. His first priority was to break the chain and get underway, but the Raja's men kept up a massive volley of arrow and cannon fire, killing and wounding many of the Portuguese sailors who attempted to cut the anchor line. Meanwhile, the fire barge moved ever closer, threatening to bring the Flor de la Mar to a fiery demise. Indeed, as they came in, the scene looked very bleak. The deck was already strewn with the dead and the dying. Vasco himself had also been wounded several times. The end for him seemed like it was quickly approaching. Miraculously, the water current of the harbor suddenly shifted. The fire barge began to drift off, only missing the Portuguese vessel by a narrow margin. Instead, it moved off towards the Raja's ships, which had to swerve to miss it. Many of them were forced to break off their attack. Gama's men finally managed to break the chain and get underway, but just as they were starting to move, the wind died and once again the massive ship was stuck. Desperate Portuguese gunners brought their broadsides to bear, but at such short range, they were mostly ineffective. However, the sound of gunfire could be heard for miles around. It was unmistakable for all those who heard it. Just as fate would have it, that gunfire was indeed heard. Vicente Sodré, Gama's uncle and vice admiral, just happened to be inbound from Kannur that morning with his entire flotilla. The sound of Portuguese cannons going off instantly brought them to full alert. Sails were fully unfurled and the fleet sailed in at ramming speed. When the wind faded, oars were frantically deployed, and in record time, Sodré was in range to attack. His fleet came alongside and opened up on the Raja's men. Portuguese gunners at this point were highly skilled, and their accuracy was deadly. With the big guns unloading upon them, the sailors of Calicut were caught completely off guard. Their ships were pummeled, and eventually they had to scatter and flee. Vicente Sodré then pulled up to Gama's ship to render assistance and provide protection. The admiral at this point was furious. Now, instead of departing immediately, he had his ships parade back and forth in the harbor as a show of force. That night, Vasco had his men gather together the Indian bodies of those that were killed in the attack. He ordered the corpses to be placed in a large pile on a barge. The ghastly vessel was then driven ashore with a note for the Samudri Raja. It read, "Vile man, you had me called for and I came in answer to your call. You did as much as you could, and if you could have, you would have done more. The punishment will be as you deserve. When I come back here, I will make you pay what you owe, and it will not be in cash." Leaving Calicut behind, the fleet made its way first to Kannur for repairs, where Vasco da Gama had a chance to take in the strategic situation. He knew that if the Portuguese endeavor in India was to be successful, it would need to hold dominance not just on the sea, but also on the land. With that, the admiral ordered the Armada back to Cochin, where a meeting was arranged with the Trimumpara Raja. Nigel Cliff in The Last Crusade surmised the proceedings. Quote, "The running battle with Calicut was threatening to capsize the entire mission, but once again Vasco da Gama found a safe haven in Cochin. The fleet regrouped, the sailors swapped stories, and the admiral met twice more with the king. Their final agreement established a permanent Portuguese factory in the city. What's more, in a somewhat surprising sleight of hand, the admiral was given jurisdiction over all the Portuguese in Cochin, and by proxy, all the Christians in India. This was no mere trade treaty. It established Europe's first Indian colony, and in theory at least, it made all of India's Christians subjects of the Portuguese crown. End quote. This Portuguese colony in Cochin, by the way, was going to be more than just a simple trading outpost. At the mouth of the main harbor, a fortress was to be constructed. Cochin was not going to be just an ally, but a fully operational battle station. On February 10, 1503, Vasco completed his negotiations. By now, his ships were fully laden down with spice, and as the monsoons were shifting, it was clear it was time to head home. However, as preparations for the return journey were being made, word arrived that the Samudri Raja of Calicut had assembled a massive war fleet. The Samudri had spared no expense. He had purchased every cannon he could buy, hired a bunch of skilled sailors, and had even gone so far as to employ the service of Arabian privateers from the Red Sea. The Raja's fleet was massive. It consisted of 20 larger ships, flanked by 40 large dhows known as sambucks, and an additional 100 smaller support vessels. On hearing this news, Gama assembled his war cabinet, and along with his vice admiral Vicente Sodré, it was decided to seize the initiative and launch an attack. The Armada set sail immediately. 2 days later, they spotted the enemy fleet inbound from the north near the coast, a few miles from Calicut. Before the Raja's ships had time to assemble, Gama had his armada form up in a long straight line, thus bringing all of their broadsides to bear, which, perhaps in recorded history, was one of the first times this naval tactic was employed against another fleet. His men got lucky. They scored several direct hits. In doing so, they annihilated the entire leading wave of incoming vessels. The Arab privateers took the bulk of the damage. Many were sunk or put out of commission before they could even return fire. Despite this, the faster-moving sambucks were sent in with the hope that their speed could outmaneuver cannon fire and close the distance to board the slower-moving Portuguese ships. Nigel Cliff explains, quote, "A new cry went up on the Portuguese ships. A swarm of sambucks and long rowboats were heading toward them from the city, all armed and with their guns already firing. Gama's men scrambled to return fire, but the boats kept on coming. The Indians had learned to push on until they were past the range of European guns. That way they could put their numerical advantage to use in hand-to-hand fighting." End quote. Vasco moved decisively to counter this new threat. He ordered his slower-moving spice ships and carracks to sail on to the north, providing long-distance fire support as they went. At the same time, he had Vicente Sodré take command of the faster caravels and use them to draw off the sambucks. The intercepting maneuver stopped the sambucks in their tracks. They were now sitting ducks for the Portuguese line of fire. At this point, the Raja's fleet had taken on way too much damage. Morale faltered and his ships broke and retreated in full rout to the city. But this was not going to prove to be a safe haven. A sudden gust of wind gave the Portuguese Armada the speed it needed to sail in, which it took full advantage of. Then, at near point-blank range, the ships of the Samudri and his allies were hunted down. Some of the ships were destroyed outright, others were grappled and captured. The rest were set on fire. Surprisingly enough, Vasco didn't order the city to be bombarded again. Perhaps he knew that his old rival had already suffered enough embarrassment. Or perhaps, more importantly, it dawned on him that attacking the city would not bring the Samudri to terms. Either way, that day Gama knew he had won for Portugal a stunning victory. But he also knew that the Raja of Calicut was not going to give up easily. It became clear to both sides that this was going to be an all-out war. With the Samudri's fleet and his reputation left in ruins, the Fourth Portuguese Armada made its way north to Kannur. They were heavily laden down with spice and had limited time before the coming of the monsoon winds. In Kannur, the admiral met again with the Consolidating Raja, who was more than willing now to accept Portugal as an ally. Word of Gama's stunning victory, after all, had spread along the entire Malabar coast, bringing many of the city-states towards the Portuguese side. Like in Cochin, a permanent Portuguese settlement was also established in Kannur. But for Gama, this wasn't enough. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors explains, Quote, "The Portuguese now started to introduce a toll system for shipping along the shores of the Malabar coast. They issued safe conduct passes called cartazes that ensured protection for the vessels of friendly powers. This was effectively a tax on commerce. In time, it would require merchant shipping to trade in Portuguese-controlled ports and additionally pay substantial import and export duties. This marked a radical shift in the Indian Ocean. With the coming of the Europeans, the sea was no longer a free trade zone. The cartaz system introduced the alien concept of territorial waters, a politicized space controlled by armed force, and the Portuguese ambition to dominate the sea." End quote. It was on February 22, 1503 that the Admiral of India laid in a course for home and departed. His second great voyage to the east was coming to an end. However, as he left, Vasco da Gama was very worried. The fact that the Samudri of Calicut was able to raise a decent navy meant that the sea would be contested. Furthermore, the admiral knew that if Portugal was to be successful, it would also need to dominate the land. Thus, a system of fortresses would be absolutely critical. Taking in the strategic situation once again, the admiral formulated what needed to be done till more Portuguese forces could arrive. Vasco ordered his uncles, Vicente Sodré and Brás Sodré, to remain behind with their ships. This was to be the first permanent Portuguese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Vicente and Brás were given multiple objectives. First, they were to blockade Calicut in order to cripple it economically and starve the city into submission, something that they did, by the way, very well. Second, they were also to travel to the city of Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, with the intent to bottle up Arab shipping, which was an extremely strategic move, and mark my words, would have serious repercussions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they were to defend a fortress that was being built in Cochin. Vasco da Gama and King Manuel knew that this was the key for all future endeavors. Portugal's lifeblood would hinge on fortresses like this, something that the admiral, by the way, emphasized to the two brothers before he left. To their credit, Vicente and his brother Brás initially did what they were told. But then, the allure of Arab shipping coming out of the Red Sea became just too tempting. Their greed overcame their strategic insight, and for that matter, what they were ordered to do. Despite the desperate pleas of its Raja to remain and provide protection, both Sodrés decided instead to abandon Cochin. Leaving only a handful of Portuguese behind, the two sailed off to get richer. Vicente and Brás made their way to Aden. There, they raided and plundered and killed anything they could find. Arab ships proved easy targets for these experienced captains. But then, Mother Nature intervened. Near the Red Sea, both men were caught in a storm and were shipwrecked. It was said that Vicente drowned immediately, and that Brás, who was despised by his men, was killed in a mutiny that followed. The Portuguese initiative in the Indian Ocean had now been seriously compromised, not to mention that Cochin was now nearly defenseless. The news of Vasco da Gama's, and more importantly, his Armada's departure, along with the deaths of the Sodrés, made its way back to the Samudri Raja of Calicut. This was music to his ears. Roger Crowley gives us the tale. Quote, "With the Sodrés' departure, the Samudri Raja acted promptly. He created and then advanced with a large army towards Cochin. Along the way, he dispatched a letter to its king, pointing out the evil consequences of offering a place to the Christians, from whom he had received so much harm. And he demanded that the king of Cochin hand them over. Otherwise, the Samudri Raja was determined to enter Cochin, destroy it, and seize the Christians with all their things. This thunderous message was met with outright refusal. The king of Cochin had decided to throw in his lot with the Christians. He would live or die by his decision." End quote. By some estimates, the Samudri Raja had 50,000 men on the march. He had created this vast army by combining his forces with that of all of his other vassals. In a sense, he was all in. The Portuguese, on the other hand, had a few hundred, along with perhaps 8,000 Nayar warriors of Cochin, who, by the way, were not exactly thrilled to fight for Europeans. Now, if the Samudri was able to capture the city, destroy the Portuguese fortress and outpost, and apprehend, and most likely then execute, the men of Portugal who were stationed there, it would prove absolutely disastrous for the entire Portuguese cause. Make no mistake, this was a game changer. Thus, with such a massive army advancing on the city, it was clear that the Portuguese presence was now hanging on by its fingernails. Yet, in this dark hour, Portugal had a commander who rose up to answer the call to defend the city. However, with such long odds, this general would still need a miracle if he, his men, and his country's position were to survive. That all said, whether he was ready for it or not, the battle for Cochin had begun.